Here we go.
Because I find it awkward, especially if you're sharing a mic and it gets in the way, but whatever you want, this is you call the shots.
So this is our sound check. Y'all folks back in the kids section there, can you hear me okay? And you're comfortable and okay? And I'm going to pull that heater real fast.
No, you're not, because I'm going to move it.
Oh.
Oh,
Nice.
it wasn't a hint. No, I wasn't complaining. But it's better, you're quite right.
Yeah, white noise is no big friend. All right, hi everyone. I'm so glad to see you all here. I'm glad you all made it. And I'm really grateful to have such a wonderful crowd here this evening for Deirdre Kelly and Ivan Sayers. This is amazing. Before we get started though, first thing, please silence your phones. Let's do that. Every so often I forget to mention that and I'm wind up rocking out to somebody's ringtone. So now I write it down on my tiny list. And I wanted to take a moment to gratefully acknowledge that we are gathered here on the unceded and occupied lands of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples. We are so lucky to be here in every way. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about what's going on here at this bookstore. This is just a baby bookstore. We've only been here 4 months as of Sunday. And we're having the most amazing events. I feel, again, incredibly lucky. And next week we have Dennis Garnham, who went on the pilgrimage road to Compostela after his theater career came to a crashing halt with COVID, to kind of figure out what was up with his life and his future, and also his faith as a gay Catholic. And his memoir, Toward Beauty, is on the shelf up at the front with the other event books. He'll be here next Tuesday. That event is ticketed. The ticket is $22, which comes with a copy of the book. That is the price of the book plus tax. Also coming up on November 30th, we have Tara Sidhu Fraser and Rachel Murphy. They are the authors of, on one hand, When My Ghost Sings, a memoir of life after an early stroke. And Rachel Murphy, whose novel, From the River to the Sea, is kind of a time travel story of 2 men with very different stories growing up at different times along the Fraser River. Quite amazing, and we're really lucky to have them both. And then on December 2nd, we have a musical fundraiser for Bug's Backyard Theater, which is a youth-run, all-queer theater troupe. And they will be here doing performances, including original work, to raise funds for their production of Heathers in the early spring, so that'll be really fun. All right, I'm so stoked. A month ago, this wasn't happening. We had no idea. And Deirdre got in touch, and we scrambled to make a fun night for everybody. Your work, by the way, on getting this together was amazing. And I got to very quickly introduce myself to this lovely book. Fashioning the Beatles is, I think, a great gift for anybody who's into visual culture and art history and fashion history. And it looks at the story of the Beatles and all the things that they pulled together to make the looks that made them distinctive visually to their fans, and then how they influenced the next, what is it now, 60 years?
Multiple generations.
Yeah, 3 generations of fashion. And we are incredibly lucky also. I say that a lot, but I'm just so grateful. I live in gratitude for this. To have Ivan Sayers to help interpret this evening for us, and to bring some context by interviewing Deirdre this evening. So please welcome Deirdre and Ivan.
So, I think I get to talk first. I'm also impressed to see so many people here. I have just had a couple of chances to look through the book in a cursory way, and it's impressive, and I certainly want a copy. That's a hint. If you missed it before, that's a hint now. And remember, when people want your work, it is a compliment, even if it's that backhanded one. What impressed me just now when I had a chance to look through it again is how many of the photographs I've never seen before. So that is something I want to talk to you about. But first of all, I think, what prompted you to write the book?
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And this is a great honor for me. I don't know if you know, I'm from Toronto. I'm not one of you. And I arrived just today, and it's a great pleasure and privilege for me to be here. So thank you very much, and to be in conversation with Ivan Sayers, a wonderful fashion historian. So, why did I want to write this book? And sometimes I think, well, don't you all know? I'm Beatles obsessed. I've been obsessed with the Beatles from a very young age. I decided, though, to write a book about fashion originally, not necessarily about the Beatles. I am a former, long-time Globe and Mail staff writer, where I was in the arts section for, as I said, very many years. I wrote on dance. I was a dance critic, and I wrote a book on dance, because if you know anything about my business, it is true what they say about us. We're usually fish wrap, or what you put in the bottom of a bird cage. There's an ephemerality to what we do, and I wanted to anchor all the years of practice and writing and experience and thinking into a book form, something that wouldn't be easily tossed. So I did the ballerina book, and Nina has kindly brought that in here today, so it's also here. And then I was transitioned, as one is sometimes without wanting to be, at my newspaper, to fashion. I was asked to be the fashion reporter, and I was doing that for several years at the Globe and Mail. And again, my thinking was, well, I want to solidify, once upon a time, she did this, you know, even for myself or for my children. And I was racking my brain to find a fashion subject that hadn't been done before. In fact, my publisher for the ballerina book and a previous book, Paris Times 8, is here in Vancouver, Greystone Books. So we had a lot of correspondence, and it was good, but not good, good, not good. And then I just had, you know, this gnawing, wish I could think of something original. And I was yapping about it in my kitchen to my long-suffering husband, who just was stirring his coffee. And out of the blue, he just quietly turned and said, no, your next book's got to be on the Beatles. And I kind of had a hand, I said, like, why, you know? And he said, because you're Beatles obsessed. Yes, but what could I possibly say about the Beatles that hasn't been said before? And then because I had fashion on mind, unless of course it was about their fashion, and then it was that epiphany moment, heard the thunderclap, the sky opened, and I was like, whoa, what did I just say? And then I rushed, I'm a library person, I rushed to the library to see if anybody had written on the topic before. There was one book, but it was written from a mod perspective, and with all due respect to the writer, he got a lot wrong. And I saw a lot of omissions, so it really was a few. He's opened the door wide open for me, and I'm going to do it. Easier said than done, actually, because what I just mentioned is it hadn't been done before. The research was grueling, and it took many years to do it, because it really is fresh territory.
How did you manage your research? Because, as I mentioned, when I looked at the book, there are so many photographs I've never seen before. And I'm sure they're hidden away in archives or private collections or whatnot. But finding them, even with the web and whatnot, I'm sure was a real challenge. Did you, I expected there was only going to be a few, but most of them I've never seen before. Did you have trouble getting copyright permission? Did it cost you a lot of money to get copyright permission from professional photographers and things like that?
It's a great question, and no one has asked me about that. And in fact, of course, a book like this, the visual component was going to be important. And now I'm going to take a big confession here. For many years, in fact, I couldn't sell this book because of the photos. Every publisher who took the time to tell me why they were rejecting this book, it was because they felt that they wouldn't have the budget to do it justice. The estimation was minimum $20,000 US in order to get the
Just for permission fees.
yeah, to do it right. And I had interest, Omnibus Press, I'll just give them a shout out. They didn't end up signing me, but I was excited. Omnibus has been publishing Beatles sheet music since '63, and it would have been terrific to work with them. But you know, he wrote me and said, you know, we've talked, we love it, you've got a great idea, we just don't think that we can do it justice. So, flash forward, I then ended up writing the book anyway. Again, I want to give credit where credit is due. Pierce Hemmingson is a Canadian Beatles authority, someone with whom I got to know. I'm actually part of now of more of an international Beatles community, and he strongly encouraged me to do the book regardless, and he even said he self-publishes. His book, if you're interested, is The Beatles in Canada. It's an absolute fantastic tome. It's like, you know, the proverbial phone book size. And so thanks to Pierce, I did do it. And then I even had someone like Louise Dennis, if anyone knows who that is, Graham Greene's niece, CEO of Random House Penguin. And she called me in, just she and I in a big boardroom, you know, then she, even though it was a big boardroom, sat this close to me and she said, you have a terrific idea. You have found a niche, you have found something, I want to encourage you. But again, this whole discussion about the market, you know, because when you get photos, what happens, and I didn't know this, was the paper stock has to be a lot higher in order to absorb the inks, excuse me. So that's apparent. That's what she said. You know, we look at it and then right away we're like, oh, that's $50 retail price. So there was all this going on. So, gosh, I'm giving you a lot more detail here, but thank you for the question. So I just want to give sort of flash forward, and then I finished it. I had a draft last summer, last July, and I just thought I'll send it to someone I know in my newspaper industry, which is Ken White. He is the former founding editor of the National Post, former editor-in-chief of Maclean's magazine, and former editor-in-chief of Saturday Night. We'd never worked together, but I knew that he, like I leading newspapers, he had formed Sutherland House Books, which is an independent Canadian press. And I just thought, I'm going to send it to him. And I didn't know he was going to take it. It kind of happened very, very quickly, which now I'm getting to answer your actual question about the photos. So I only found out, I can tell you the date, January 24 of this year, that he wanted to take the book on. And then to my astonishment, he said, we're going to make it a fall release. I asked him later, I said, because it killed me to do all that work in 6 weeks, which included then finding photos and trying to do it on a minuscule budget, because this is an independent Canadian press.
The photographs before
No, we
they
didn't.
agreed to print?
We didn't have it in advance.
I don't want to interrupt that story, but what is interesting to me is, were there any archives or sources that were really helpful and generous, as opposed to people who are trying to exploit the situation and make as much money out of you as possible?
No, with the exception
That's the reality.
of Pierce Hemmingson, because Pierce, having done his own Canadian book, he had some great tips for me. He told me that if there were magazines in the public domain over a certain age, and you took the photo of them or whatever, it's a bit convoluted. Well, in other words, he owned images that had been published in newspapers and magazines that he kindly gave to me. So for instance, the very first image in the book is of the Beatles and their splendiferous transformation at the time of Sgt. Pepper, but it's just in advance of the Sgt. Pepper launch, and they're walking through Hyde Park in Beatle capes and various vintage finds, which I think you'll find interesting. And I just wanted to set the tone there. And then at the very end of the day, we could not get that photo. It wasn't in the public domain. Again, there was a lot of research about that had been taken by a gentleman, Marvin Lickner, for Time magazine. And there were, there was evidence of these photos existing, sometimes they were showing up on Pinterest, but you can't purchase a picture on Pinterest. And what had happened is that he took the photos, but because Sergeant Pepper launches literally the next day and became such a cause celeb, so Time just like dropped that story to go with the Pepper. So those photos never did see the light of day. So they weren't available to purchase. And it was thanks to Pierce Hemmingson, who had taken a photo of it that had appeared in a German magazine in the day. It's a very convoluted story. So then he did help me. In terms of who exploits, Getty has the lion's share of Beatles images in the world, and they're thousands of dollars US each. Apple, the Beatles' own company, does have original Beatles images, and I'm very happy that you said that you've not seen a lot of these pictures before, because that was a primary goal for me. I wanted people to be impressed and astonished too by some of the looks, and that you are having a fresh experience of this band. Yes.
When your customer's going to buy, you don't want to buy pictures you've already seen.
So in the end, I hired a young lad in Toronto, a photo researcher, and he was indispensable. He, for instance, there's a gorgeous photo, I'll say it because I really am into them. It's a gorgeous photo of Paul and John together that the great Brian Bailey had taken in the day. And again, this was going to be thousands of dollars, but this young man had been the photo editor researcher at Hello magazine, and he just had great, first of all, he came from my world. He knew about editorial, he knew how to hustle, and you have to go really fast and be a little ingenious with trying to find things that people don't want you to have. So ergo, he found a copy of it at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and we were able to purchase it, gosh, I think like $250.
Wow.
We also got some things, by the way, here from Vancouver. I definitely referenced that. There's a bit of a, maybe segueing now into some of the costuming that we have here, how the Beatles inspired fashion in the day, and there were many replicas of their looks carried by major retailers like the Bay. And I believe I have the image there is from Vancouver and advertising, hey boys, be a hit, wear a Beatles jacket.
I saw the Beatles here in 1964.
Yes, I was thinking
so that was
now
one
we
of the
stop
reasons
talking
I
about me and we talk about
to be here. As I said, I was brought up in Summerland, so we came down for that weekend. And it was one of those sort of rites of passage when you're still in high school. You're suddenly a grown-up because you can go to the big city with a bunch of other teenagers. And as I said, they were that big because we saw them from a distance, of course. But it was a sacred moment. And certainly that would have been when I was probably in grade 11 or grade 12. And certainly Beatle jackets became a huge fad. And I brought 3 of them. Not ones that I had at the time. My mother actually made me one.
I was going to say, a big chunk of my book is about that, the DIY effect.
And it was a lot of
McCall's,
that. I
people
talked to
putting out-
someone the other day, and he said his mother made
Yeah.
one for him. Mine was pumpkin colored, and I wanted one that wasn't like the others. So I have
Just like a Beatle.
absolutely. You want to stand out.
Yes.
You don't want to be a freak, but you want to stand out. You want to be remarkable. So I have 4 of them because I kept one in each color to represent each of the 4 Beatles. The other one is red, and I couldn't find it. But because you're talking about your reference to Vancouver, these all have labels in them made by factories in Vancouver. So that's why I saved these ones. I am limited by space. The other thing that I brought was this pair of trousers here, which I don't really remember where I got or how long ago, but the Beatles are featured right there in a corrupted manner. I'm sure this was not a bona fide, endorsed by the Beatles kind of thing. I got another pair of trousers at exactly the same time with more jungle prints on them, and I think they're actually golf pants. They're not really for the disco or whatever, so because they are so similar, there's no label. Then the other thing I brought was this little dead thing, which was Don Frank's Beatle wig when he was about 14, and it's made out of
Can't believe it's Don Franks's.
That's the guy I got it from. Not the company who made it or what have you.
No.
Anyway, it was his attempt. It looks a bit like he's trying to be a monkey or a yeti or something. But anyway, this was his great treasure. And Don's 65 or 70 now. I don't know how old he is. He gave me this 2 years ago when he could finally part with it.
Incredible. So again, I'm hoping many of you will get the book, or at least borrow the book or read the book. I have a big section about beetle wigs, for instance, because there are many things that we could talk about. Your style points, what is a Beatles look, you know, and if I maybe even said to any of you here, what's the first thing you think about when you think Beatles style? Many of you might even say hair. Maybe you would say the lean and mean modernist silhouette. Maybe the Beatles boots, you know, high heel boots. We could talk about all these different things, but the hair in particular was a flashpoint.
It was
Especially,
scandalous.
yes,
It was
you got
scandalous.
the word scandalous. And even to our eye, maybe some of it might seem tame, but when they first come to North America, right, it was scandalous. It drove fathers and sons apart.
The
It had
church
boys
groups.
expelled from schools. Yeah, and I even quote the great anthropologist Margaret Mead. Everyone's weighing into the debate, the argument, is this the end of civilization? Is this the effeminacy of the man?
Absolutely.
You know, and
There were
but
going to be no more babies.
yeah, that's right. But the fans saw it for what it was, which was subversive. It was unique. It was the Beatles being authentic and doing it their way, and the kids just all wanted to eat it up.
Independence, that's, you could do something and it wasn't permanent, it could be changed. And you could, if you needed a job, working in a restaurant, you could comb your hair back, or you got a Beatle wig. And I know people who did that, I was working in that world myself at the time.
Interesting.
But that haircut was such an important step. It was the first thing, and the Beatles obviously learned from that anything they did was going to be copied. And that's why I thought so much of when you get into the psychedelic period there, it's so wonderful. They put color into men's clothing and eccentricity, and it wasn't a threat to their masculinity or to society or anything. It was just fun.
My take on that too is I really wanted to emphasize about the Beatles is that they were heterosexuals, they weren't homosexual, but they were so confident in their masculinity
It wasn't
that they weren't
derogatory.
threatened by the feminine or even the feminine energy or even feminine so-called fashions or directions, say.
Not at all.
So
They
they
were above it.
were growing their hair, you know, even if it got them labeled as effeminate, they could give a crap at all.
Absolutely.
And-
liberating for everyone.
And then, in terms of the color that you just spoke about, that definitely comes from, it starts in Carnaby Street, and it's something that I wanted to speak, especially given the theme of our bookstore. It's a queer bookstore. There was, and if you realize this, but homosexuality in Britain, I don't know about here, but it was against the law until
Was here too.
1967. So there was, however, you know, lots of gays, but you had to go underground. And Carnaby Street was created close by the gay, well, they didn't call it the gay baths, but there was the bathhouse that was very prominent close by. And there was a retailer at the time, in fact, he wasn't a retailer at the time, he was a photographer of muscle men, of beautiful male bodies. And Sean Connery, former Mr. Scotland, was one of his models. And what he wanted to do was show the body, the male physique, even more. So he started designing and cutting away these little briefs. And So the gentlemen who were in the bus, who would come by his photo shop that was close to Carnaby Street at the time, which was a backwater, it was a dump. Rents were very, very cheap. And he started just selling these gear through the catalog. And there was such a demand because the men wanted to show themselves off a bit more. I do say that, not to take anything away from the Beatles, but there is a lot of right time, right place when they're born.
In fact,
And
that
that
was one of my
movement is
questions.
coming. I'll let you.
Because they were so conspicuous. I wonder, what do you think their impact was on the whole success of Carnaby Street and the whole thing about Mary Quant and Biba and all these people who were essentially London designers, who traditionally people wouldn't have paid too much attention to because Paris was and probably always will be that Central European hub anyway. But suddenly, the British designers in that little backwater, I went to Carnaby Street after the fuss was over. It was so boring.
Yes.
I couldn't believe that that had been the fashion center of the world for young people. But it was thriving. And was that because of the Beatles and their fame?
Absolutely, yes. And in fact, I'm not sure, I know there's a lot of fashion people here, fashion historians too. If you've not read him, you must read him. Nick Cohen. There are no gentlemen today. It's a seminal book of male pop fashion. It's very hard to get it. It costs thousands of dollars on Amazon. But my wonderful Toronto reference library had a copy, and you couldn't borrow it. But I read it cover to cover. And in fact, he very much details the influence of the Beatles on precisely what you just said. It wasn't that Carnaby Street made the Beatles. It was absolutely the other way around. And it is an authority, and I'm glad you brought that up because that is something that was very thrilling for me to read. And in terms of Mary Quant, she's a 50s person. Okay, she starts her boutique in 1956, and by the way, when I was talking about the Carnaby Street influence coming up, that's 1956. That's John Stephen, who eventually becomes known as the King of Carnaby Street, gay man from Glasgow. And they are a late 50s phenomenon, as I mentioned, but it's because the Beatles start wearing these clothes. And they are wearing Mary Quant, even though she's associated with women's wear, but I can maybe detail that a little bit more for you there. And in fact, I write about this in the book because in the 60s, with the Beatles leading the so-called British invasion, which at the time was pop music, but it wasn't just that. It opened the doors for all kinds of cultural exports from London, which included fashion. And it was very interesting for me to define this, is that because the Beatles were now on such a world stage and everyone was emulating them. For instance, they got the MBE from their Queen Elizabeth, 1965. Why? Because they started wearing corduroy, a laborer's cloth. It absolutely wasn't the fashion, but because the Beatles wore it, suddenly all the kids were wearing it, and lo and behold, the manufacturing industries that had been a lot more dormant post-war Britain, they were suddenly revived, and the Beatles themselves were bringing in so much money into the national accounts. So I actually detailed, the numbers are all there. And that is part of the reason why they got the MBE.
A lot of people here might not know that corduroy was for work clothes.
Yes, it was
Originally,
a fustian
it was for work
fabric.
clothes.
You didn't wear it. I mean, the Beatles didn't invent that. I actually want to give credit to Pierre Cardin. In 1960, he launches the first ever menswear fashion show in Paris. He creates what we now know as the collarless suit. He called it a cylinder suit. He was quite a fashion revolutionary. He had been in women's wear, then he crossed the floor into menswear, and that was itself, as I said, right time, right place. So these energies were there. The Beatles were a fan of his work, so they were aware again of the subversive element in putting corduroy in a something that had gone onto a couture runway, and so they started wearing it. But they also, by the way, if I just finished about the collarless suit, they always remembered that look. Now remember, it was 1960 when Pierre Cardin does it, but it has an influence, and there are these new boutiques that are opening up in London at the time, Cecil G, for instance, on Shaftesbury, and it's Paul McCartney who went in to purchase one of these collarless suits, a replica, and it's 1962, so it's gone a little bit more mainstream, in other words, as fashion will do. If it starts in the couture, then it can go down into the street. And it's when their gay manager, Brian Epstein, suggested to them that they start getting clothing done by Dougie Millings, a tailor to the stars as he was known. He had a reputation for dressing a lot of pop stars. Well, the Beatles came in and said, right, you can dress us, but we're not going to look like Cliff Richards and the Shadows, who was one of Dougie Millings' clients at the time. And they said, we want something different. How about this? And it was Paul McCartney who came in with the collarless suit. I know this for a fact because Gordon Millings, Dougie's son, is still with us, and he was very kind to give me an interview, and he remembers Paul especially having a brainstorming session with Dad. So in other words, also, there are many things we can talk about here, but the Beatles, no one ever told them how to dress, how to look. They even if they were working with top designers and top tailors, they told them what they wanted. They were very in charge of their look, and they were among the very first pop groups, if not the first pop group, to make that investment in their look a part of the stage presentation.
Well, they got to be so big so fast that that's not unreasonable, that they could call the shot.
Well, may I just interrupt
Sure.
there? But they did that from the get-go, before they were famous. Before they were famous, they were tweaking their looks. And the other thing about them, you kind of touched on that, they were not yesterday's men. They were always pushing it forward. If any of you are fans of their music, you'll know what I'm talking about. There's no one record that sounds the same as the other. Ditto with the look. So even when they inadvertently were setting the trends, that collarless jacket, for instance, it became a mod staple.
But
and when the Beatles saw that everybody else was wearing it, they dropped it. They
what I
do
was
not
gonna say.
wear that suit in 64. It's 63 only. Think about it. They come to America, they don't wear it, ever.
And
They
that's one
drop
of the
it and
things
they
about
move
their
on.
music too. As soon as they had imitators,
They,
they moved on.
yeah.
And that was one of the reasons the imitators were so frustrated, because they couldn't keep up.
But the other thing that was really interesting, talk about their influence in general, manufacturers found them fascinating. They started looking to them as the barometer of the next thing, next big thing. And so
Well, that's what fashion is, it's a business. What's
I
next?
actually, when I was writing my book, in a way, I was thinking, not in a way, but it came to me that in a way, I keep saying it like that, but that the Beatles themselves were like fashion. They were always in pursuit of the new.
Well, then that's fabulous. I mean, if you can do it, it's wonderful. And they had the need for the wardrobe, their publicity, they had the money, the opportunity. Sorry, I'm using my cheat sheet here. Since we're talking about the designers, you say you talked to this one designer's son. Were there any of the designers that you actually got to talk to directly, the tailors or whoever that were still alive?
This is so good. These are great questions, like the goody
I'll give you
parts.
this after.
Yeah, this is the goody part. Yes, I don't know. I have a bit of a list now. Unfortunately, many people are no longer with us.
Mary Quant.
So
This year.
exactly. But And someone just died this past summer, in July, Edward Sexton, the master cutter who worked for Tommy Nutter, who was the new kid on the Savile Row block in 1968, 1969. You will know the work of Edward Sexton right away because 3 of the 4 Beatles are wearing his suits on the cover of Abbey Road. It is always attributed to Tommy Nutter, as it should, because Tommy was the front man, but Edward Sexton cut those suits, chose the fabrics in consultation, again, he told me, with the Beatles. And Mr. Sexton, yes, I got an exclusive with him, and I think one of the last interviews before he sadly passed away, as I mentioned in the summer. I also, for me, this was great. I spoke to John Pierce, who was the tailor at Granny Takes a Trip, a seminal boutique of the 60s, the psychedelic era, 1966. Again, you might know what I'm talking about if you're Beatles freaks like I am. The paisley shirts on the back cover of Revolver were made by John Pierce. So I got a wonderful interview, sat down with him in his shop. He's still tailoring. He's got a shop in Soho, John Pierce. I also spoke and got to sit down with him, and he was lovely. Robert Orbach, who was the founder of I Was Lord Kitchener's Valet. And he worked for John Stephen on Carnaby Street before he did I Was Lord Kitchener's Valet, which is post-mod, which we can talk about fashion's pendulum swing. You have the whole mod look, and then it goes very vintagey, kind of what we're doing today. And that whole military trend, by the way, which you see on the cover of Sgt. Pepper, Paul McCartney, and I quote him, said that, well, we knew that trend was out there on the street, so we thought, okay, we're going to take those moth-eaten, uniforms of Empire, and we're going to make them out of the shiniest material, make them so brand new, even though it's old. So that was, again, Paul McCartney having a sense of, we're going to do it ironically, but Orbach was the person who made that an international trend. And he talked to me about that, as I mentioned, it was the dying days of Empire, and you had all these warehouses, he said, all over Britain, filled with old military looks. So they started selling them first in stalls on the Portobello Road, and then they opened I Was Lord Kitchener's Valet. There's a reference to it in A Magical Mystery Tour, the movie, as well. So that was really thrilling. And then to the present day, because my book isn't all about the past, it's about how the Beatles' influence left their music in fashion endures. So a great interview for me was Anna Sui, who's a very prominent New York women's wear designer, and her quote is, I think I still have it, "I owe my entire career in fashion to the Beatles." And then I got similar references of a Canadian, Joe Mimran, not a designer per se, but he's a visionary entrepreneur here in Canada. He's Joe Fresh, and he's the founder of Club Monaco. And just like what you were talking about, he gave me an anecdote about watching the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964, and Mom, you gotta make me that suit. He still remembers it was houndstooth, but he also told me that they are the reason he went into fashion. So I think I'm missing some people. Leslie Cavendish, the Beatles hairdresser. He was tremendous with me. He opened a lot of doors. In fact, he's the reason I was able to meet Robert Orbach when I went to London on a research trip. And he cut Jane Asher's hair. He was an apprentice of Vidal Sassoon, and he was cutting Jane Asher's hair, who was a British actress, who at the time was Paul McCartney's girlfriend. And he said, she's getting her locks done, and he only was doing it because her regular was sick that day or so. "Oh, do you think you could cut my boyfriend's hair?" And yeah, and who's your boyfriend, love? And he's telling me this whole story. It's like, that Paul McCartney. And then he started doing, cutting his hair in Paul's house. And as, again, I do talk about that in the book. What one Beatle did, the other Beatles soon followed. So Paul's like, hey, I've got this guy's cutting my hair. Then he starts cutting George's, and he starts cutting John's, but he doesn't cut Ringo's. Does anybody know why? Because he was married to a hairdresser, Maureen Cobb, so no one was allowed to touch Ringo's hair but Maureen.
Have you sent a copy of the book to Paul or to Ringo?
No, I have not, but I
come
suppose
on.
I've been asked to do so.
Christmas is coming.
Yes. Now it's interesting because someone in Los Angeles who is it's from Vancouver. Yeah, I keep bringing it all home. He is the maker of Fidelity jeans, and he's in Los Angeles. I interviewed him for the Globe and Mail, and recently he was in touch about something. One of my articles, he wanted to get a copy of it, and then I told him about the book, and he says, "Oh, well, first I want you to come down to LA and do an event." And can you please send 3 books? One for me, one for Dave, one for Paul. You know, listening on the phone. He means Dave Grohl of Foo Fighters, and he meant the Paul McCartney. So yeah, I have to send them a copy, and one to Ringo.
Excellent. Fame at last, eh?
Yes, noticed by my guys. Okay, but they've noticed me before. I've interviewed Ringo. I've met him again.
6 degrees of separation now,
my
everybody.
position at the Globe and Mail. I got to interview him, and I got to hug him. He smelled really good. And then
We'll never let you leave town now, you know.
And then my Paul McCartney story when I met him. Now, we'd need an hour for that, but just suffice to say, I crashed one of his parties, and I met him by chance because I was trying not to get arrested. It was a big New York City ballet soiree. He had just created the score for a new work. Stella McCartney did the costumes. And I was like this, literally looking down, like hoping the cops weren't going to get me because I did sneak in. And then it was one of those things where when I wasn't looking where I was going, and it was him, of all the people in the whole group. And then he held me. Hello, how are you? I was like, and then, anyway, as I said, we need an hour, but we were actually in this embrace this close for a good 10 minutes, because when everybody realized Paul McCartney was in the room, everyone started crowding around us. And when I say everyone, I mean Sarah Jessica Parker, Ralph Lauren was here, Lorne Michaels from Saturday Night. It was surreal. But anyway, I know what Paul's skin looks like. I can tell he was very finely wrinkled, like parchment paper. Yeah.
We only want to know the good things, just the good things.
Yeah. So I've met them, in other words, and I wouldn't have been shy to speak to them. But I had, again, great encouragement at the beginning of writing this book by Mark Lewison, who is the world's authority on all things Beatles. He's written the first of a trilogy, which will be the definitive biography of the Beatles, called Tune In, all those years. He's still working on volumes 2 and 3. Volume 1, by the way, it's about 1,000 pages, and it just ends in 1962 when the Beatles released Love Me Do, so it's that detailed. Again, I had a great privilege of interviewing him and meeting him in London, and he advised me not to go to them because the Beatles are notoriously prickly about anyone seeming to be making a buck off their fame and reputation. And he said he didn't rely on them, and he said they had faulty memories anyway. You've got the anthology, and this is what I said earlier about the research being so intense and grueling, because it was combing through all sorts of sources in order to get their original words, if they said anything on the topic, and actually ends up they say a lot of it. It just hadn't been isolated before. And frankly, when I even did more of my research, I saw the point. Speaking of these beetle wigs, I do mention them in the book, and it was because it was part of a merchandising deal that Brian Epstein did with a company. They called themselves Celltab, which is the Beatles spelled backwards, and it was the lousiest deal ever. That Celltab made equivalent to today's money billions off the Beatles, and the Beatles maybe made a few thousand off this deal. So we're talking all that merch, which might include, for instance, this Beatles handkerchiefs, Beatles lunchboxes.
We think this is one of the oldest things around here,
yes,
anyway,
it's incredible.
because it's from Germany. So it's right at the very beginning. This is actually out of Klaus's collection.
Oh, amazing, amazing. So
it sounds like you enjoyed this process.
I
Even the
did,
agony, right from the beginning. This is all, I don't know about your other books, but it sounds like it was so exciting right from the very beginning.
You know, thank you very much for saying it like that, because I told you, and everyone else spilled my guts to you, no one wanted to have it at the beginning. And it was so much work, such a great amount of work, in doing it really, and never knowing if anybody would ever see it or read it, excuse me. But I kept driving myself because it really was fascinating, and it was so interesting, and it was exciting, and sometimes literally dizzying, because you'd have this chameleon-like element of the Beatles. You could get 3 or 4 distinctive looks in a given year, and trying to catch up with it, not just to catalog it, but why? What was happening in the culture? What was happening in politics? What was happening with them as a band, the group dynamic? How were they pushing themselves forward as artists? How did clothing mirror their artistic development and everything that they saw themselves as, which wasn't just as musicians. They were rock and roll artists. They really wanted to be artistic. And so everything about them. So yes, it was really exciting, but there was that element of, I don't know what's going to be. So it was sometimes discouraging, and it was also very hard. So for instance, there is still a big question mark for me. It's a small detail, but maybe fashion people will get it. You know, Paul McCartney wears a pink suit quite a lot in 1968. Where did he get it? You know, and I could never find the answer to that. So there were things like that, trying to find the provenance. And also, speaking of Mark Lewison, that's one of the things he's doing, and why it's taken him a million years to do his research, is because the Beatles have entered into mythology almost. There's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of incorrect information that is taken as fact. And so you have to, is that really what happened? Like, that's the journalist in me too, is to unpack it and try to get to the truth of it, and then try to find people who might remember. Oh yes, another Vancouver connection here. I had a great interview with Andrew Loog Oldham. He actually now lives some part-time here in Vancouver. He is the Stones manager. Many of you might know that. But he, in the day, worked for Mary Quant. And then, briefly, he worked for Brian Epstein, just as the Beatles, you know, juggernaut was just taking momentum. And he remembers vividly what that was like, watching them dress and watching them, and I'm going to use a colorful language. He said how they exuded a fuck you attitude, you know, even though they were dressed to the nines. And they were the original bad boys, by the way. Speaking, now I brought up the Stones. The Stones were the properly educated and raised young men. And then when Oldham became their manager, it was like eureka moment. I know, I'm going to turn you into the anti-Beatles. And so again, the influence was, there was both a positive and negative in the pop culture at the time.
Do you know if any of them saved their wardrobe?
Oh yes, that's a great question. I know that they did. I know, another person I interview in the book is a Canadian, Jerry Levitan. Jerry has written his own book about the Beatles called I Met the Walrus. Jerry was a 16-year-old besotted Beatles fan in Toronto, heard on Chum Radio that John and Yoko were coming into town, figures out they must be going to the King Edward Hotel, the King Eddie, So he's told me this. He has a little microphone, and he's knocking on all the doors of the hotel. And then a chambermaid told me, took pity. Hey, kids, over there. And then when he knocked on the door, all these, hardcore, probably Toronto Star, Globe and Mail people, Telegram at the time too, get out of here, kid. But then he said, he was like, I want to talk to John about peace. And it happened that John was walking by inside the room. Let the lad in. And so he came in, and anyway, there's more about that. There's a great story he told me about all the clothing that John brought with him to Toronto, even though at the time he was going very minimalist and was only appearing in public in either all white or all black, but he traveled with his clothes. He was very, very attached to them. Continuing why I bring this up, because Jerry told me, because he did the I Am the Walrus, and that became an Emmy Award-winning film with whom he collaborated with Sean Ono Lennon. So he's now friends with Yoko and Sean. He's been to the Dakota, present-day Dakota. He told me there's a huge room, maybe the size of, maybe half the size of this, but it's filled with John's Beatles clothes.
After all this time.
He kept them.
Wow.
And I know that George Harrison kept his clothes as well. And we know this because some of them have lately been, I don't know if completely donated, but they're on loan in certain museums around the world. That's another thing I read about, that today Beatles clothing has become like a fine art collectible. It's commanding huge prices at the auction houses, and it is being spotlit, in leading museums and galleries around the world. Ringo Starr, I know, everyone will know if you want to just look this up. He kept a lot of his Beatles clothing because just a few years ago, like while I was researching the book, maybe it was about 4 years ago, he put a lot of it up for sale. He was purging, and so people were able to purchase it. Paul McCartney is very interesting. Paul is very possessive of his Beatles clothing, and he is known to have pulled items of his clothing that had been stolen by fans, and sometime maybe generation later, someone goes, look at the Mom, I didn't know Mom had this in the attic, and put it up for sale. And when Paul gets wind that any of his things are being put for sale, he stops the auction. I actually wrote about that. And he gets his things back. I know that Ringo has done the same thing whenever he's seen something. So they're very, very possessive of their clothing, and they've kept them.
That's great.
Yeah, it's very
Someday.
interesting. Oh, and Paul,
think of the exhibition that can be one
yes,
day.
I'm just going to say, by the way, there was a film, one of the films, and Paul wore his tuxedo that he wore to the Hard Day's Night opening just a few years ago. It might have been.
You should curate that exhibition.
Yeah, I would
You've
love
written
it.
the book. Here
I
you
love
go. Do it in London
bring
and
it, colorful
bill it
box.
as a charity fundraiser for the Victorian Albert
Okay,
Museum
let's
or
do it.
something like
Done.
that. Okay.
Dear, oh my goodness, we're going to do
Okay.
something. I'm coming
That's a
back.
great idea.
Definitely. Imagine how
Yeah, the
successful that would be. People would come from around the world to
It
see
would be
that.
super to
Absolutely.
do it. I just need a
Months and
platform.
months and months, yeah.
Even
Your
if-
book is the first step in that.
Yeah, thank you.
So yeah,
Thank you so much.
that will make you the star, that's for sure. I have no idea what time it is because the time is flying. But one of the things we did want to do is invite the audience to come up with questions. If you've got any thoughts or unsolved mysteries that you think.
Paul's
that-
pink suit, who knows?
Yeah, right. You never know.
I'm curious, when you say you're Beatles obsessed, how did that manifest before the book? Like, how did your husband know? What did you do?
Because I'm always talking about them and shush, they're on the radio, and turn it up.
Well, actually, what I wanted to ask, could you still have the husband after writing
Yeah,
this book?
no,
If he was
he's
faithful.
so supportive. In fact, I give him a huge acknowledgement because not only for, in a way, coming up with the idea, but he was so wonderful in listening. How does this sentence sound? He was my soundboard, and he was very encouraging. But to your point, my mother passed away a year ago, and what do you call them? My archives, meaning all my artwork. How if you have a supportive parent, they keep all your stuff. So I went through my mom's stuff, and yeah, so I'm 7, I'm writing about them. I'm 12, I've got book reports on them. I know in grade 6 I did public speaking at my school at Thorncliffe Park Public School in Toronto, and I was actually supposed to go into some major, I was selected because my talk was on the Beatles. I have, in grade 7, my mother still had my ceramic plate that I did at my school, and where I've signed it, Deirdre Kelly. Yeah, I went by a nom de plume. Now I'm remembering this. I think, yeah, around the same time I was Rita McCartney. Lovely Rita McCartney. Everybody knows, my friends often call me DK Beatles freak. So it was always there, so he would know, because I have, yeah, you should see how many books I have. Anyway, excuse me, there was another lady here.
Oh, I'm no lady.
No.
I'm a fellow Beatlemaniac.
Oh, sorry.
Just curious.
And I see, yeah, you have your Beatles OPP Paul McCartney patch.
Oh, hell yeah. Sergeant Pepper, right? Anyways, I'm curious, it's not really a question, I guess, but you must mention in the book, of course, when the Beatles opened their own fashion business.
Yes, and a huge bit of it's its own chapter. So that's a good point. So I mentioned that in the book for sure. That what I'm arguing is that fashion wasn't a frill. It just wasn't just costuming for them. It was, in fact, innate to their genius and to their, as I mentioned, ambitions too as a band, and their artistic ambition, and it was a form of personal expression. But it also was the very first manifestation of their Apple business. And they opened the Apple boutique in London at the corner of Baker and Paddington in a non-fashion district. Again, they're off the beaten path. And they were the first pop band to have a branded fashion presence or identity. And it was called the Apple Boutique. You probably know they had their label was the Apple, but the music actually came after. And it was actually a failed enterprise for them. I don't get into that as to why. But it wasn't that they went on, sod it, we don't want to do this anymore. At the same time as they're having a lot of problems with the original Apple Boutique, they go on the King's Road and invest in a very important menswear boutique at the time called Dandy Fashions. It was founded by Tara Brown, the man who blew his mind out in the car, immortalized in A Day in the Life. He was the Guinness heir, and Tara had founded Dandy Fashions. And after his death, it was taken over by John Criddle, who he was an Australian. By the way, the father of Darcy Bustle, Britain's premier ballerina. And John Lennon really liked him, and because John liked him, he got all the other Beatles to get involved with him as well, and they all invested into Dandy Fashions and had it rebranded as Apple Tailoring. So where the Apple Boutique was much more, let's say, hippie-esque, and that actually was the problem, because Beatles didn't forecast properly how long it took to manufacture things, so they were turning out hippie-esque clothes at a time when the pendulum had swung again to a whole other aesthetic. When Dandy Fashions positioned itself, or Apple Tailoring positioned itself as a lot more high-end, so it was a lot more tailored suits, again, bespoke. And that was another designer I spoke to, was the former Mrs. Criddle, Andrea Bustle, mother of Andrea Bustle. She actually made those suits, and she talked to me about that, and she said, as she put it, I liked a nipped waist. I said, we were all so thin then, we never ate anything, so the silhouettes in the men's clothing, it was also part of the time. But yes, so the Beatles were very involved in fashion, even as a business. Yes, sir.
Do you have anything you can tell us about the influence of Indian culture that was brought?
Oh, yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was huge. And
Did everybody hear the question?
yeah, the question was, can we talk about the influence of Indian culture on the Beatles? And I just said that was a huge element. Now, I want to give credit here to Dick Lester. Richard Lester is also his full name, American expat who was living in Britain at the time. He's a filmmaker. He makes A Hard Day's Night. He makes the Beatles' next film, Help. And this is where this East meets West fashion fusion is starting to come in. If you can see in the dress mode in the film, you get a lot of that, but you also have the sitar. You have the whole plot, in fact, about an Eastern cult. You know, Ringo's got the ring. So I bring this up because at the time I didn't know maybe that it was Dick Lester who kind of set pace there. I found an interview with the film's costume designer who also died while I was researching the book, so I kind of dismissed her, but I knew of her. And she talked about how Dick was very aware of the Eastern influences that were coming then into London, really by the upper classes, because these were aristos, the new jet set, following the hashish trails, drug trails, going abroad, Afghanistan, India, Morocco, bringing some of the threads back, mixing them with their heirloom finds in their country estates, which is actually, if you look at that you'll see that mix and match. So it was in the street, and Dick Lester, maybe being an expat, you know, he was very aware of what maybe nuances or smaller things that were happening in the culture. So he knew about the Indian fashions coming in, and he told the costume designer that he wanted these elements in the film. And indeed, you'll see the Nehru collar John Lennon's wearing, it's embroidered. There are other fashion innovations in that film too that have nothing to do with the Eastern culture. That's a whole other thing. Again, Dougie Millings working with corduroy, doing faux military, corduroy shoes. George Harrison requested that to match the outfit. That became itself a trend. But the movie Help, that's when we first see it, and it's always attributed, George Harrison is always attributed, that's where he got into Eastern mysticism. They were exposed to the sitar, so it all kind of started there. Then that, I guess, seed planted, it was Patty Boyd, George Harrison's then wife, who was the first to get interested in transcendental meditation. And she told her husband about it, who of course then tells all the other Beatles, and what one Beatle does, all the other Beatles do. So they go to hear the Maharishi, and eventually they go to Rishikesh in the Himalayas to the ashram. I had a wonderful interview with a Canadian, Paul Saltzman, used to work at the NFB, and he was nursing a broken heart, happened to be at the ashram at the exact same time as the Beatles. So he saw what happened. He said how the Beatles, so it's been brought up, oh, did the Beatles co-opt that? Were they being disrespectful? And he said no, in his opinion, and gives a couple of illustrations. One, they were deeply respectful of Indian culture, and they wanted not to be the rock stars, you know, coming in. They wanted to dress and blend in, so to speak. And there was a man, he said, who was sitting cross-legged outside the gates of the ashram, who had a sewing machine on the dirt, and he made clothes for people, and the Beatles got all their clothes. You'll see them in the Indian garb, almost that homespun cotton, all the saris that the Beatles' wives and women are wearing. Paul Saltzman, by the way, as I mentioned, he was with NFB, he was a filmmaker, he was a photographer. You look for those photos, they're the only photos we have of the Beatles at that time. By stark contrast, he said that members of the Beach Boys were at the ashram at the same time, because they figure out the Beatles are there. Donovan was there, by the way. But he talked about, by contrast, the Beach Boys then brought their 60s fabulous fashions with them, and they're walking around with top hats and, you know, Edwardian cut coats and velvet trousers, and he said it was a travesty and it wasn't respectful at all. So the Beatles deeply, as I say, they respected it. All of the surviving Beatles to this day talk about that they still have their mantra, you know, that they were given, and they're very, very devoted to that influence.
Good stuff. Good stuff.
This is fascinating.
Any other questions? We're on a roll here. So. Well, what about you? You got any questions that you haven't answered yourself, or what do you want to do next?
Oh my gosh.
I think that exhibition is a great
Yeah.
idea.
Absolutely.
If you can find the right sponsor, someone, and not to exploit the Beatles, but if it could be done for something like the Victoria and Albert Museum or one of the greater foundations to support such an enterprise. When they did, at the V&A, when they did the Alexander McQueen exhibition, for the last 3 or 4 months of the show, the museum stayed open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because so many people wanted to see it. That would certainly happen with an exhibition like
Absolutely.
this, where people truly, we've got friends now who are
Absolutely.
in London to see the Chanel show, and they've gone specifically for that. If you can convince a sponsor to get you whatever it needs to do that, it will be mind-blowing. This is your first step, and it's a good one. I gotta say, I was really impressed. So,
Thank you so much.
so thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Nina, do you have any wind-up thoughts?
Just thank you so much for doing this, Ivan, for putting together this lovely interview and preparing so well, and the generosity of your time. And we have books. We have lots of books.
And I have a pen, if anybody wants it, personalized or not. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Okay. Where are the books en masse? Are they at the front? People have a look.
Lots of fun.
Yeah.